In the middle of a brutal Midwest blizzard, one woman opened her doors and her heart to a convoy of freezing soldiers. But what the army did the next morning left the whole town speechless. Would you give away everything, expecting nothing in return? The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the windows of Kingston's stop. Snow slashed sideways across the sky, turning the world outside into a swirling void of white. The highway, once alive with the steady hum of engines and distant horns, had vanished under layers of ice and silence. Inside the diner, Linda Kingston moved with determination, her breath visible in the frigid air. The old boiler sputtered like a dying animal, barely pushing out warmth, but she refused to shut the doors. The diner was dim, lit only by a few emergency bulbs powered by the aging generator in the back. Each flicker of light cast long shadows across the booths, where two truckers huddled over lukewarm coffee, shoulders hunched in thick coats. Linda refilled their mugs with practiced hands, her own fingers raw from the cold, but her face calm, resolute. Her father's photo, framed and draped with a small American flag, hung above the counter. Robert Kingston, 1948 to 2012. Vietnam vet, founder of the diner. A plaque beneath it read, "For those still serving, for those still driving. You're home here." Linda glanced at it for a moment, then went back to prepping a pot of chili on the gas stove. She didn't say it out loud, but she could hear her father's voice in her head. "Keep the light on, kid. Someone's always out there, counting on you." Outside, the storm worsened. Around 7:15 p.m., just as she was ladling soup into bowls, the front door flew open with a blast of icy wind. Linda rushed to shut it, then froze. 12 soldiers stood just inside the threshold, faces red and raw from the cold, snow clinging to their uniforms like frost to a pine tree. Their sergeant, a man in his late 30s with piercing gray eyes and a streak of white at his temple, took a cautious step forward. "Ma'am," he said hoarsely, "we're with the 302nd. Our convoy got caught about 5 miles up. Everything's dead, engines, radios, heaters. We saw your sign from the road. Is it okay if?" Linda didn't wait for the rest. She grabbed a stack of towels from the rack behind the counter and tossed them toward the nearest soldier. "Get in. Strip off the wet layers. Sit by the kitchen. It's warmer back there." The soldiers hesitated, stunned. "I'm not asking," she added, walking toward them with the kind of authority that left no room for argument. "Let's go." She guided them in, ushering them toward the industrial ovens, now glowing faintly in the kitchen's corner. One by one, the soldiers sank into mismatched chairs, their gloves steaming as the heat began to bite through the cold in their bones. They tried to speak, to offer her money, to apologize, to explain, but Linda waved it off. "Food's hot. Don't ask. Just eat." She laid out everything she had left: chili, cornbread, soup, sliced ham from her dwindling freezer stock. The soldiers devoured it silently, the way only those on the edge of exposure could. It was only after they'd begun to thaw that one of them, a tall man with a soft southern accent, gestured toward the wall behind the counter. "Is that your father?" he asked. Linda turned. Her eyes softened. "Yeah, Robert Kingston, 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines." The gray-eyed sergeant stood and walked closer. His face changed as he stared at the framed patch mounted beside the photo. His voice dropped. "He was in Da Nang?" Linda nodded. "Twice. Got sent back after his first tour. Wouldn't stop talking about the guys he left behind." The sergeant let out a slow breath, almost a sigh. "I'm Jake Morrow. My old CO was with 3rd Marines. I grew up hearing those names." He pointed to a list taped beside the photo. Names of fallen comrades Linda's father had insisted never be forgotten. "I think my uncle was with him." There was a long pause. Jake looked around, his expression shifting. Respect, recognition, maybe even something deeper. Linda broke the silence. "Generators on its last legs. We'll have enough power for maybe a few more hours. After that, it's blankets and body heat." Jake nodded. "We've slept in worse." By 9 p.m., the storm had sealed the town. Snowdrifts piled 6 feet against the diner's sides. The power grid flickered and finally died. Linda lit kerosene lamps, placing them in every corner of the warehouse behind the diner, her emergency storage and supply room. She opened the roll-up doors and gestured for the soldiers and the remaining truckers to follow. "We'll make do. We always do." Inside, she laid down wooden pallets, draped them with cardboard and blankets. A dozen bodies huddled together, the chill creeping in through the concrete floor. Linda moved like a medic, passing out soup in plastic mugs, refilling a battered coffee urn with precious hot water. Jake took over the task of organizing. He assigned buddies, checked frostbite, wrapped hands in gauze. When a young private began shaking uncontrollably, he whispered stories into his ear. Stories about resilience, about men surviving worse, about hot summers in the jungle and the relief of rain. Linda watched him from the edge of the room, her back against a metal shelf of canned peaches and expired soup. She was exhausted. Her eyes stung from smoke, her arms ached, her feet throbbed. But she didn't stop. One soldier tried to give her a wad of damp bills. "No," she said, gently pushing it back. "At least for the food." No, her tone was quiet but absolute. "You served. This is my duty." Jake heard it. He nodded slightly, saying nothing, but his eyes said everything. The storm raged on through the night, but inside Kingston's stop, there was warmth. There was silence, yes, but not the hollow kind. It was the silence of survival, of gratitude too deep to be spoken. And just outside, under a mountain of snow, a battered road sign flickered beneath a frozen streetlight. "Kingston Stop Hot Meals. Open late." It was barely visible now, but for the people inside, it had already done its job. It had led them home. The blizzard did not ease. If anything, it grew more vicious, the kind of cold that found its way into bone and memory. By midnight, Linda Kingston had stopped counting the number of headlights that blinked dimly through the snow before fading behind the diner. Word had spread, maybe through trucker radios, maybe through luck, that Kingston Stop was still open, still warm. By 1 a.m., there were more than 30 people inside. The warehouse, once a quiet place for surplus boxes and old chairs, had become a patchwork sanctuary. Linda had laid out every wooden pallet she could find, every strip of cardboard, every ragged quilt that had once lined booths in the old diner. There were makeshift beds in corners, soldiers pressed shoulder to shoulder with truckers. A Labrador someone had picked up at a rest stop was curled beneath a pile of coats, tail thumping weakly. Linda worked like a machine, filling bowls with soup, pouring water, checking on anyone who looked too pale or too quiet. Her boots left trails of wet snow across the linoleum. Her fingertips were raw from the cold. Jake Morrow had become her shadow. He didn't bark orders like a soldier. He moved quietly, checking pulses, tying up a tarp over the back loading dock to block the wind, showing a young trucker how to warm his hands without risking frostbite. Linda found him kneeling beside a veteran in a wheelchair, adjusting the man's scarf like it was the most natural thing in the world. In the few calm moments between tasks, they talked. Not much at first, small things, weather patterns, engine failures. But around 3:30 a.m., as the storm screamed just outside the steel walls, they sat on overturned crates near the ovens, wrapped in silence. Jake spoke first. "I was in Fallujah. First time we got hit hard. My best friend was 5 feet from me. Then he wasn't." Linda didn't respond right away. The hiss of the pilot light filled the space between them. "My dad told a story like that. He was in Da Nang. Said he stopped hearing gunfire one day because the screaming was louder." Jake looked up. "What was he like?" She smiled, but it was a tired smile. "He was a ghost long before he passed. Never really left Vietnam. He started this place to make peace with it, I think. Said he wanted to build something no one could destroy. A safe place. For truckers. For vets. For anyone out in the cold." Jake looked around at the rows of strangers now asleep or dozing on makeshift beds. "I'd say he succeeded." Linda's eyes welled. She blinked fast. "Sometimes I wonder." He leaned forward. "You kept this open, knowing what was coming. That's not just duty. That's legacy." They sat for a while longer in silence, each of them letting the warmth of the moment buffer the harshness outside. But even warmth has its limits. Just before dawn, a burst pipe above the bathroom exploded like a gunshot. Water gushed across the concrete, freezing almost instantly along the far wall. Linda swore under her breath and rushed to shut off the valve. Jake grabbed towels and started soaking up what he could. Panic rippled through the shelter like a quiet breeze. A trucker murmured that his radio had said the regional power grid might be shutting down. A woman in a reflective vest whispered that gas lines were freezing across the county. Another man reported seeing ambulances stuck in snowdrifts back in Des Moines. It was too much for some. A teenage driver curled into a corner, shivering despite 2 layers of jackets. One of the soldiers began pacing, muttering that they should have stayed with the convoy. Tension thickened. Linda stood up on a milk crate, her voice strong but calm. "Listen up. We have heat. We have shelter. We have each other. If you're here, you're not alone. We're going to make it through." Jake backed her up, moving among the crowd with reassuring nods and quiet words. The fear didn't vanish, but it stopped spreading. Later, Linda returned to the kitchen and found a note scrawled on the back of a paper menu. "Thanks for keeping the fire lit. Br." She stared at the letters for a long time. Her father's initials. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her apron pocket. As morning approached, her strength began to fade. She leaned against the prep counter, eyes half closed. Her legs trembled, not from cold, but exhaustion. Jake saw it. "You need to sleep." "I can't." "Yes, you can. 10 minutes. I'll keep things running." She started to object but saw the sincerity in his face, the steadiness in his eyes. 10 minutes, she said. "No more." He helped her onto a cot in the office behind the diner. She lay down fully dressed, boots still on, and closed her eyes. Jake stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching the snow fall through the cracked window. Somewhere out in the storm, help might be coming. Or it might not. But inside Kingston's stop, for now there was warmth. There were stories. And in the stories there was life. The first sound that broke the stillness of morning wasn't the wind. It was engines. Low, deep, and methodical. Linda Kingston stirred from a brief, uneasy sleep in the office, her eyes snapping open as the warehouse walls trembled slightly. Not from the storm, but from movement outside. She bolted upright, boots already on, coat half-zipped. As she stepped into the corridor, Jake met her halfway. "They're here," he said simply. She followed him through the diner to the front entrance. Outside, the blizzard had slowed, but the snow was piled thick, waist-deep in places. Through the frosted windows, she saw them. For camouflaged Humvees rolling in, heavy tires grinding against slush and ice. Behind them came 2 larger trucks, green, armored, purposeful. A soldier jumped down and waved for space. Another rolled out a portable generator. And then came the man himself. Colonel Nathaniel Wolfe stepped from the lead Humvee like a man arriving in hostile territory. Broad shoulders, buzzed gray hair, posture that commanded instant attention. His face was weathered and firm, his expression unreadable beneath mirrored glasses. He didn't ask for permission. He strode into the diner like it was a battlefield checkpoint. "Who's in charge here?" he barked. Linda stepped forward without flinching. "That would be me." He looked her up and down, taking in her messy braid, soot-stained coat, and red-rimmed eyes. She met his gaze squarely. "What is this?" he asked, gesturing to the warehouse beyond. "Some kind of civilian relief shelter?" "No," she replied, calm but pointed. "It's a truck stop. My father built it. When the storm came, we didn't shut down." Jake appeared behind her. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Morrow, I should have known." "Sir," Jake said with a respectful nod. Wolfe turned back to Linda, expression skeptical. "You're telling me 30-plus civilians, a dozen of my soldiers, and a stray dog are sleeping on pallets in a storage room, and nothing's gone wrong? We've had frozen pipes, 2 panic attacks, and 1 trucker nearly passed out from dehydration," she said, her tone steady. "But other than that, it's been peaceful." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. He walked past her and into the warehouse, his boots thudding heavily on the concrete. Linda followed, heart pounding. He moved like an inspector, glancing over blankets, noting how meals had been organized, speaking quietly with a soldier who smiled and nodded in her direction. When he stopped in front of the wall where her father's photo hung, proud in his dress uniform beneath a faded American flag, his posture changed. Just slightly. "What unit?" he asked. 101st, Firebase Ripcord. Wolf nodded almost imperceptibly. He was there. Lost 2 fingers and most of his hearing. Still came home and built this place. The colonel turned back to her. "Your father's name?" "Jack Kingston." A pause. "I remember that name." They stood in silence, the distant hum of generators now echoing off the walls. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a government-issued envelope, stuffed with crisp bills. "For services rendered," he said, holding it out. Linda didn't move. "I'm not taking your money. It's not charity." "No," she said firmly. "It's duty." Just like it was his. Wolf hesitated, then withdrew the envelope. "All right," he said slowly. "What if we strike a deal?" She tilted her head, wary. "Let the army use this warehouse as a temporary supply depot. We'll bring in real beds, medics, food, fuel. In return, we fix the roof, reinforce the insulation, and ensure no one here freezes before the storm lets up." Linda stared at him for a moment, weighing it. Then she extended her hand. "Deal." And with that handshake, everything changed. The transformation happened fast. Army engineers moved in with tools and materials. The shattered roof panel over the warehouse was replaced within hours. Fuel barrels were rolled in by soldiers, with truckers helping to unload them. Veterans from town, hearing what Linda had done, showed up with flannel shirts, coffee, and a quiet willingness to help. One elderly Marine even brought his grandkids to shovel the sidewalks. Jake coordinated truck deliveries like a battlefield supply chain. Linda ran the kitchen like a general. Soldiers and civilians alike began to call her ma'am, with a mix of respect and affection. By nightfall, the warehouse glowed with heat lamps and camaraderie. A long table was set up where soldiers played cards beside truckers, and children passed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Linda stood in the doorway of the diner, hands on her hips, watching the operation run without her needing to lift a finger. Jake stepped beside her. "You did this." She shook her head. "He did," she said quietly, glancing at the picture of her father inside. Jake smiled. "Maybe, but you brought it back to life." And in that moment, with the storm still howling beyond the gates, Kingston Stop was no longer just a diner. It was a command center, a sanctuary, and a legacy. The storm had finally surrendered. What was once a blinding wall of ice and wind now stretched into an open sky, pale blue and endless. Snow still covered the ground in heavy banks, but for the first time in days, sunlight cracked through the clouds, painting the frost-covered world in gold. Inside Kingston Stop, the final morning felt like the end of a strange dream. The makeshift shelter buzzed with quiet energy. Soldiers packed their gear. Truckers checked tires, topped off tanks, and made plans to get moving. A few volunteers refolded blankets, scrubbed trays, or passed out thermoses of strong, hot coffee. Linda stood behind the counter, back where it all began. Her apron was stained with grease and soup, her hands cracked from the cold and constant washing. But her eyes were soft, her movements calm. There was a peace in her now, the kind that only arrives after doing something that matters. Jake Morrow was already up, helping an elderly veteran secure his rig's frozen tarp. He'd spent most of the night loading boxes and organizing departures, but still found time to quietly shovel the back entrance without being asked. He barely spoke, but his presence had become a constant, like the hum of the refrigerator or the warm hiss of the coffee pot. At 8 a.m. sharp, the dining room fell quiet. Colonel Wolf stepped into the center of the room, flanked by 2 soldiers. For once, his voice wasn't commanding, it was respectful, even tender. "I know many of you are ready to move on," he began, removing his gloves and tucking them under his arm. "And I won't keep you long. But before we go, There's something that needs to be done. He turned toward Linda. You could have closed your doors. You could have told my men to move along. But instead, you turned this place into a beacon. For soldiers, for truckers, for everyone caught in the storm. He nodded toward one of his aides, who stepped forward holding a small wooden box. Years ago, your father was recommended for a medal he never received. It was lost in paperwork, buried in bureaucracy. But I served with the men who fought beside him. I know what he did, and after what you've done here, it seems only right that the medal find its home. He opened the box. Inside was a bronze star, gleaming in the morning light. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Linda's eyes filled instantly. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the box, her thumb brushing the inscription. She couldn't speak. She didn't need to. Jake stepped forward and saluted her. Others followed. One by one, the soldiers, truckers, and veterans stood and saluted. Some stiff and proper, others more casual, but each filled with quiet reverence. Even the youngest volunteer, a teenage girl who'd passed out peanut butter sandwiches the day before, stood with her hand over her heart. Linda didn't cry. Not exactly. But her chin quivered, and when she finally managed to speak, her voice was raw with gratitude. He always said the war didn't define him, but helping people, that's what made him whole again. Thank you for letting me do the same. A few hours later, the convoys began to roll out. Tires crunched over packed snow. Engines rumbled. Air brakes hissed like exhaling giants. The Humvees left in single file, followed by the trucks, each one honking softly as they passed by the diner's front window. One final salute. Linda stood outside in her heavy coat, her boots buried in the snowbank, hand raised in farewell. Only one vehicle remained behind, a flatbed with a metal crew from the Army's engineering unit. They worked quickly and quietly at the corner of the lot, installing something in the ground, bolting it into the frozen concrete. When they finished, they called her over. The plaque gleamed bronze, freshly mounted at the foot of her father's old flagpole. She bent down to read the inscription. Kingston Stop, where no one freezes on our watch. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Later that morning, the diner was quiet again. The pallets were gone, the kitchen cleaned, the generator humming low. Everything was still, almost normal. Linda poured herself a mug of coffee and walked outside. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows over the snowy road. A pair of trucks passed by, one honking softly as it went. She raised her mug in greeting, smiling at the sound. Then she sat on the bench outside the diner, beside the plaque, her breath a silver ribbon in the cold. She didn't speak. She just listened, to the hum of tires on asphalt, to the creak of her father's old sign swaying gently in the wind. In every engine, she heard his voice. In every passing trucker, she saw the life he wanted to build. And in the silence, she found her own legacy. Quiet, steady, and enduring. A home for those who serve. A haven for those forgotten. A place where no one is ever left out in the cold. This story reminds us that kindness, especially when it's hard, echoes further than we can imagine. If you were Linda, would you have done the same? Tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please give it a like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more tales of everyday heroism. See you in the next video.